Good evening to all the participants. I, on behalf of Madras Tax Bar, welcome all of you to this session. The session is going to be between Aditya Reddy sir and Joseph Prabhakar sir, who will be moderating the entire session. So the session, Prabhakar sir will start first. Then Nitin will continue with the session. Then Aditya sir will continue, and then Joseph Prabhakar sir will come and finish his presentation. And after that, we will have a question answer round with the panel. So in the meantime, if you have any questions, you can the chat box is enabled. You can send your questions to the chat box, or it is advisable to send the questions only to me or Joseph sir. Don't send it to everyone group because it will be disturbing. And or you can raise your hands in the app at the end during the question answer round. Then we can take up questions as time permits us. So thank you once again. I welcome all the panel members on behalf of the. Over to you, Joseph sir.
Yeah. Good evening, all of you. Today the session is the pattern is going to be like this. We'll do a presentation on one of the recent decisions of the Kerala High Court with reference to advance ruling and the place of supply. After Aditya will take over, and then he is going to discuss about the retrospective amendment to section 140, which is the talk of the town today. We will refer to various decisions, and then he will take us through the nuances of the decision as well as the implications and all that. Then after that, I will do a very short presentation on section 16.2. So just a very small point on that. Then at the end of my session, after all three of us finish, then we can have the question answer session. So I'm sure this is supply. The three of us are coming in, and then probably the presentation of Aditya Reddy and of course mine are separated out by semicolon or colon. Full stop will come only after the end of the question answer session. Over to you, Nitin.
Yes, sir.
Nitin,
Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt just before you start. I'm really sorry.
Yeah.
There seems to be some background noise at your end. Can you just check?
My end? One second.
Yes.
1 second. Yeah. Hey, आवाज मत करो, बहुत आवाज आवाज complaint करो. Prithvi, is it fine now?
Yes.
Sorry. Apologies for the disturbance. Yeah.
No problem. Continue.
Is my screen share visible, Prithvi?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Good evening, everyone. I thank members of the bar. I thank especially Joseph Prabhakar sir having trust on me, an youngster like me, to present on this platform. I also thank AP Srinivas sir for accepting Joseph sir's views, and also all the coordinators who are working on this Madras Tax Pass webinars every day. And lastly, my brother Prithvi, who has been taking untiring effort every day in organizing this session. And now moving on to the session, the topic which I have decided for today's discussion is jurisdiction of authority of advance ruling for determination of place of supply under GST. Starting with who can approach an advance ruling. Any person, either registered or unregistered, as per section 97 of the CGST Act, an applicant can approach to the advance ruling if he is facing some uncertainty in implementation of GST law, or he is facing some unique situation on payment of the prescribed fee as it has been prescribed under the rules, can approach the authority of advance ruling and seek a ruling on the question which he has an uncertainty. Now, the very important question is, on what question can he approach an authority of advance ruling? Subsection 2 of section 97 of the CGST Act enumerates the list of questions on which an authority of advance advance ruling can be applied for. Starting with an assessee who has some uncertainty on the classification on rate of tax of a specific goods or services can approach the authority of advance ruling, or whether a notification is applicable or an exemption provided in a notification is applicable to him or not, on determination of the time of supply or the value of supply, or whether an input tax credit is admissible or whether it is barred, and determination of liability to pay tax, whether it is an interstate supply or an intrastate supply, whether it amounts to export or not, and also whether he is required to register under the GST Act or not, and also an activity done by an applicant, by a person, whether that would amount to supply. For on all these questions, a person can approach an authority of advance ruling. Now, the very important question here is, clause A to clause G do not contain a specific question on place of supply. So, what if a person approaches an advance ruling and asks a question on place of supply, or a question on a question relating to place of supply, only when a place of supply is determined, the question on place of supply is answered, the question enumerated under A to G can be answered. Can the advance ruling, authority of advance ruling, raise its hands and say it doesn't have the jurisdiction, or it has the jurisdiction to answer the question? That is the point of our discussion today. Starting with, there have been quite very few cases in which the authority of advance ruling has decided on the place of supply. Like I have taken two cases here, starting with T&D Electricals. This was a very recent decision of the authority of advance ruling Karnataka. In this case, the applicant here had a bill to ship to transaction. So he approached the authority of advance ruling of Karnataka in the capacity of an unregistered person, whether this transaction office would amount to a bill to ship to transaction, or the bill to ship to transaction, whether it is an interstate supply or an intrastate supply. Now, for determining it, the authority of advance ruling first determined the place of supply. So, while providing this advance ruling, the place of supply was first determined, and it was not dismissed that since the question is relating to place of supply. In the case of Global Reach Education Services Private Limited, in this case, the applicant here was promoting foreign universities courses, namely the Australian Catholic Universities courses in India. So now, for this service, he was receiving some commission from the foreign counterpart, from the person in from the foreign university. So now the question before the authority of advance ruling was whether the commission received, it was also on a foreign exchange, and this commission received for the services which applicant is providing to the foreign university would qualify as an export of service or not. While answering this question, the authority of advance ruling said he is acting in the capacity of a representative of the foreign university in India. Hence, he is providing an intermediary services as per section 13(8)(b), and therefore it is an intermediary services and it's not an export of services. Further, the appellate authority of advance ruling also upheld the ruling of AAR that it is not an export of service. So, for determining an export of service, place of supply is an essential condition, and in this case also, place of supply was decided. On the other hand, there have been plethora of decisions. I've quoted only 6 decisions over here. There are so many decisions, around 20 to 25 decisions, where the authority of advance ruling, on the face of it, have rejected the applications since the question was relating to place of supply. There was one very interesting case which we are going to discuss today evening. That was on Sutherland Mortgage Services Incorporation. Here, this case was before, it was an advance ruling before the authority of advance ruling Kerala. In this case, the applicant is located at Cochin at Kerala. Now, what happens? The applicant has a principal company in USA named Sutherland Mortgage Services Incorporation USA, who is the principal company. They are engaged in the business of information, IT enabled services, information technology enabled services, such as providing mortgage orientation, etc. Due to the requirement of United States of America's law, legal procedure, the restrictions are imposed that the principal company is barred from outsourcing its work to any third party. Therefore, what happened? The applicant in India, in Cochin, has entered into an intra-company agreement with its foreign counterpart, with its principal company at USA, that it would be providing to the customers outside India. And also, the applicant in India entered into an agreement with the foreign customers that services would be mortgage-related services would be provided from USA as well as the Indian branch. Now, this agreement was mainly for the purpose of transfer pricing regulations. Now, what happens is the principal company who is in USA pays the consideration to the Indian company at Cochin. So, but the service is being provided directly to the customers outside India, not to the principal company. But the consideration is being received from the principal company by the applicant in the form of consideration, and also an invoice is being raised on the principal company. Now, the question before the authority of advance ruling, which the applicant sought, was to determine the liability of tax, whether this transaction between by the applicant in India and providing the service to the customers outside India would qualify as an export of service or not, based on the intra-company agreement entered between the applicant and its principal company. Now, the contention of the applicant was, the applicant contended they are located in India, they are providing services directly to their customers outside India and not to their counterpart, not to their principal company. So the supplier is in India and the recipient is the customers outside India, and also the consideration which is received, it is received in a foreign exchange, and thus they satisfy to be qualified as the transaction qualifies as an export of services as under section 2 of subsection 6 of IGST Act, and once it qualifies as an export of service, it amounts to a zero-rated supply. Now, what all to qualify as an export of service, there are certain criteria and there are certain conditions which have to be satisfied. One, the supplier should be in India. In the Sutherland's case, he is in India. The recipient should be outside India, as per the applicant's contention that they are providing services to their foreign customers, so they are also outside India. The place of supply, which is a very essential factor, is to be determined that the place of supply should also be outside India. They receive consideration or foreign exchange, and also the supplier here in India and the recipient are not distinct, or not merely an establishment of distinct persons. So we have seen what all conditions are to be satisfied to qualify as an export of service. One of the essential condition being place of supply of service is outside India. Now, the ruling of the authority of advance ruling was, they are observed that one of the important requirement for a transaction to qualify as an export of service is determination of place of supply. So AAR says, the question before me, whether it is taxable, the service being provided by the applicant is taxable or not, I have to find whether it is an export of service or not. To find out whether it is an export of service or not, I have to determine the place of supply. So the AAR says it has been created under the Act and it must function strictly within the bounds of that. And AAR says subsection 2 of section 97 does not give the jurisdiction to the AAR to decide on matters relating to place of supply. And AAR lacks the jurisdiction, thus it won't decide the liability to pay tax, as it has to decide the place of supply to determine the liability to pay tax in this case. But one of the very important point also to be noticed here is, under the CGST Act, under the provisions of authority of advance ruling, first, when an application is being filed before the authority of advance ruling, the AAR looks on whether this application can be admitted or rejected. So it looks on whether the question which the applicant is asking is under subsection 2 of section 97. If yes, accept it. If not, reject it. If it is rejected, if the question asked by the applicant is not under subsection 2 of section 97, then the authority of advance ruling would pass an order under subsection 2 of section 98 rejecting the application. If it is agreeing that the question is valid one, which can be asked under subsection 2 of section 97, then the application is accepted, then the ruling is passed, and the final order is passed under subsection 4 of section 98. Now the next is, once the order is being passed, if the applicant is agreed, appellate mechanism, appellate remedy is available. But section 100 dealing with the appellate remedy says that an appeal to the appellate authority of advance ruling shall lie only if the order is passed under subsection 4 of section 98. So for all these cases relating to place of supply, which we have seen earlier and also in the Sutherland's case, since it did not qualify as a proper question under subsection 2 of section 97, this application was rejected under subsection 2 of section 98. And as per section 100, the appeal cannot be filed since the order was passed under subsection 2 of section 98. So now the applicant was remediless because the applicant didn't have any appellate remedy. So by invoking the extraordinary jurisdiction of the Honorable High Court under Article 226, the applicant approached the Honorable High Court of Kerala. Here, the petitioner prayed before the Honorable High Court of Kerala to strike out the order of the authority of advance ruling and to hold the transaction that it would qualify for export of services. Now, we all know the Honorable High Court didn't go on to the facts of the case. The Honorable High Court didn't look on whether this transaction satisfies all the conditions for an export of service and didn't pass an order on that grounds. The Honorable High Court took the larger view and interpreted subsection 2 of section 97. The Honorable High Court said that the question which was asked by the applicant is a question which has been enumerated under subsection 2 of section 97. The question was on determination of liability to pay tax on goods or services. So the service which has been done by the applicant to their overseas customers, whether GST is payable on it or not was the question, and which is squarely covered under clause E of subsection 2 of section 97, and thus AAR cannot take a very hyper-technical view that it doesn't have the jurisdiction to answer questions relating to place of supply. The very importance of this decision was also that the Honorable High Court in paragraph number 24 of the said decision gave importance to the foreign investments in India and also touched upon the economic aspects. It said when a foreign investor comes to you, or when any person is making a new investment to you, it is a growth to a country, and questions relating to this should be answered. And also further, the authority of advance, the Honorable High Court remitted back the matter to the AAR for fresh consideration, and also directed the AAR to provide a personal hearing. Okay, now we have seen what are the facts of the case, the contention of the issue before the authority of advance ruling, the contention of the applicant, and the ruling of the AAR, and also the decision of the Honorable High Court. Now, let us also take a look from the angle of the authority of advance ruling and also from the department, whether they stating that they won't take up the questions on place of supply is right. Now, we all know a taxing statute should be interpreted in a stricter manner. And since place of supply is specifically not enumerated under subsection 2 of section 97, the department, the authority of advance ruling may be right in stating that it won't take up the issues relating to place of supply, as the famous legal maxim states, from the words of the law, there shall be no departure. This being one of the aspects, the other aspect which we can think a logical analogy can be applied, like the reason behind appointment or establishment of a GST national tribunal was especially to be dealt with the issues relating to place of supply. Why was that made? That logic can be applied over here. We all know in an authority of advance ruling of a single state, member of a center as well as member of one particular state, at which state the advance ruling is sought for, is a member to it. So when a question relating to place of supply is asked, the revenue of the other state would also be at stake. Example, an applicant approaches the authority of advance ruling for asking a question whether the transaction would be an interstate supply or an intrastate supply. The authority of advance ruling could also take a view that it amounts to an intrastate supply, but we all know GST is a destination-based consumption tax. If it was treated as an interstate supply, then the recipient state would be receiving the revenue. But here, if the advance ruling is also deciding on the place of supply issues, then the recipient state's revenue could also be at stake. On the other hand, thinking from the assessee's angle, why should an authority of advance ruling should take up the matters relating to place of supply? We all know, as the Kerala High Court has very rightly held, when a question was specific, the question asked by the petitioner, the applicant here, Sutherland, was specifically enumerated in clause E of subsection 2 of section 97, the authority of advance ruling cannot raise hands and say it doesn't has the jurisdiction to answer questions related to place of supply. Because I take the support of this very old legal maxim, which means to whomsoever a jurisdiction is given, those things also are presumed to be granted, without which jurisdiction cannot be exercised. So in the present case, AAR has the jurisdiction to determine the liability to pay tax on supply of goods or services, as the question is specifically enumerated in clause E. Since that cannot be done without determining the place of supply, here, according to this legal, if this legal maxim is applied, to answer the question on determination of liability to pay tax, the authority of advance ruling also has the jurisdiction to determine the issues relating to place of supply. On the other hand, we also had another thought that why AAR should not answer to the questions on those questions which have impact of revenue of other states also, but the fiscal interest of the other states could also be at stake. To answer that, if that was the real intention, then according to me, even the authority of advance ruling should not answer questions relating to questions when asked on to determination of rate of tax on a product, on a goods or services. Because, for example, when an applicant approaches the authority of advance ruling for determination of rate of tax, whether this product should be classified at 12% or 18%, and the applicant only has an interstate supply. Assume the applicant has only an interstate supply, and the question asked is whether this product should be classified at 12% or 18%. If the authority of advance ruling of that particular state says it attracts 12%, but on the contrary, that classification may also attract 18% rate, then the recipient state for interstate transaction would be losing the revenue. Even in that case, even in determination of rate of tax, the revenue of the other state is under stake. So I don't think that should be one specific reason. If that was the specific reason that revenue of the other state is also under stake, then even determination of rate of tax should have also not been included. Now, coming on to the case of Sutherland, in this case, the question before the authority was whether it amounts to an export of service and zero rated supply or not. Okay, so if even it is a zero rated, even if it qualifies to be an export of service or not, no other state's revenue is impacted. So at least what I think, for the transactions relating to export of services, the authority of advance ruling should give a ruling and not reject it, because it has to determine place of supply, as no other state's revenue is under stake. And also, when I was researching about it, I found an extract from the 8th GST Council meeting, where we all know the concept of advance ruling was also under the income tax, customs, central excise, being all there in the central taxation, as well as in few states, even the VAT legislations had the concept of advance ruling. The Honorable Chairperson during that time, our Finance Minister Shri Arun Jaitley, while explaining the reason behind setting up the provisions of advance ruling, the concept of advance ruling in the GST Act, said that the primary reason for setting up of the advance ruling is for the benefit of the trade and industry in financial planning from the goods and services tax aspect. So now, when a foreign investor, in the case of Sutherland, when a foreign investor comes to our country and invests here, and he asks the authority of advance ruling for an opinion whether it amounts to an export of services or not, then the authority of advance ruling raising its hand, saying that it doesn't has the place of supply, then makes the very purpose of bringing the legislation of AAR OTOs. And also, from my limited understanding of this GST law, I thought what all transactions would be covered under clause E of subsection 2 of section 97, which is under dispute now, which deals with the question is determination of liability to pay tax on supply of goods and services. So any question with any transaction or any question which has been asked under that clause E of subsection 2 of section 97, other than export of goods, because the definition of export of goods says When the goods are taken out of India, it amounts to export of goods. So other transactions other than export of goods on which the nature of tax is to be determined would obviously necessitate to determine the place of supply first. Only if the place of supply is determined, the determination of liability to pay tax can be answered. So if this conclusion is being obtained, if this is right, then I feel there is no necessity of bringing a specific clause that questions relating to place of supply can be asked, because any question under clause E other than for export of goods, it necessitates to answer place of supply. So indirectly, place of supply is covered under clause C of subsection 2 of section 97 for the purpose of determining the nature of tax, whether it amounts to an export of service, whether it is an interstate supply or it's an intrastate supply, etc. Also, I am going a little bit out of my topic, but since it relates to authority of advance ruling, I also wanted to bring in this. We all know 2 days back, yesterday or day before yesterday, there was before the Honorable High Court of Rajasthan, the Jodhpur bench, the constitutional validity of the advance ruling was challenged, and we all also had certain doubts why. We all wanted to know the reason why the judicial members are not constituted in the bench of advance ruling, even in the appellate authority of advance ruling, etc. This is an extract from the 8th GST Council meeting, where the secretary of the council says, we have the setup of advance ruling in the central tax laws, and since the judicial members are involved in it, it becomes a formal judicial process, and it slows down the rulings given by the authority of advance ruling. And on the other hand, supporting his view, the Honorable Finance Minister, at that time the chairperson, the Finance Minister, also says the paucity of the judges, the scarcity of the judges have hindered the effective functioning of the advance ruling in the income tax, customs, etc. And also he states the officials of the government, the bureaucrats, are very familiar with the taxation laws, and they can function more effectively. So I think we also understood this also may be a reason why advance ruling does not constitute a judicial member in its bench, and also the appellate authority of advance ruling. Thank you for patiently listening to me. I'm ending my presentation. Prithvi?
Thank you, Nitin.
Yeah, I also want to make a confession that this is my first presentation before such a big forum like this. I am just a junior. If any mistakes I have made, I'm ready to correct it and learn. I'm open for all the suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nitin. It's been wonderful. You did a great job. Excellent.
Thank you, sir.
I just want to add only one thing. There are 1 or 2 points. Mr. Gokarn, one of the members, I want to contribute. I want to place his contribution on this particular matter. When I did this advance ruling as a separate session, he pointed out that section 109(5) and 109(7), which deal with the tribunal, GST tribunal's power, of course not constituted as it, but still, to deal with issues. Section 5 of 109 excludes place of supply. So it includes place of supply specifically like 35L, the Central Excise 130 Customs, and 7 excludes for national bench or the regional bench of the appellate tribunal alone will have jurisdiction to decide on place of supply. Other state benches will not have the jurisdiction. So this is one of the points which I thought probably the reason is though 97(2) does not speak about place of supply, it is silent. But there is some specific mention about place of supply here. This is one. And the other one is intra-company, intercompany. This is something this general one which you probably will have to keep our mind, open mind. The matter which when I was arguing this matter before the Kerala High Court, the judge pointed out repeatedly we were referring to before the appellate AR as well as before the Kerala was doing, repeatedly the reference was made to intra-company agreement. That is the principal company in US and the branch office in Cochin. I referred to, and it was referred there as intra-company. Until the judge corrected me by saying, Mr. Counsel, how do you say it is intra-company? It's actually inter-company because it's after all a branch. Just because it is located outside India, it is not intra, it is inter. So he would have referred to as inter only, though the submission will say intra then in his finding. Anyway, so this is just a point for keeping your mind open when you do something. Yeah. Now over to Aditya, please.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everybody. So today we will be dealing with one retrospective amendment to the GST Act, which has been made to overcome a line of judicial decisions. Now, there are several retrospective amendments to the GST Act, many of which are actually intended to curtail or to be revenue friendly. But this we have chosen because this is the most latest and also a little dramatic because it was done in the middle of a nationwide lockdown. Now, before we start, I thought I'll just place a few thoughts, especially for the learned standing counsel, for the senior standing counsel for the department who are present in the audience. The effect of this amendment, which we will be discussing, is to undo the effect of certain court decisions. Now, the effect of those court decisions is to allow persons to file Tran 1 forms only up to July 2017, which means we have only 1 month more time. So I don't see what was the great need and urgency for this amendment now, when there is only such a short window for people to take benefit of these decisions. The only answer can be is that the department intends to unsettle all the benefits that have already been granted to people pursuant to these court decisions. And also the practice of amending something now to sanctify a time limit that expired 2.5 years back. This is also something that needs to be thought about, whether it is even reasonable. Now, with this, with these thoughts, I go into the main presentation. Now, this is the rule that we are considering. This is the rule that is in question. Rule 117 of the GST rules. I should mention that the transitional provisions were extensively covered already by Mr. Natarajan in the MTB webinars. So I will be dealing only with this issue of the time frame under Rule 117. Rule 117 prescribes a time frame of 90 days for a person from the appointed day, which was July 2017, for a person to file Tran 1 form to carry forward credit under the existing laws, SENVAT credit, VAT credit, etc. Now, this 90-day period was extended from time to time pursuant to an enabling provision under Rule 117(1)(a) by the Commissioner only in cases of technical difficulties. The provision enabled extension of this 90-day time limit only in case of technical difficulties, and it was extended likewise under that provision right up to 31/12/2019. For 2.5 years, it was extended. The 90-day period was extended. But the issue was, what is technical difficulty? Technical difficulty was always understood as a difficulty on the portal. So the controversy came as to what about persons who couldn't file for bona fide reasons other than due to technical difficulty on the portal. Now all these persons started going to court and saying that it is discriminatory. We also couldn't find these forms for bona fide reasons. Kindly extend this benefit of extension to us also. This is how the controversy started. Now, this is the main provision to which the amendment has been brought about. This is the provision as it stood before the amendment. Section 140, which is the enabling provision, which allows person to carry forward credit from the existing laws, SENVAT credit, VAT credit, etc. If you notice, I'm not reading the provision as entirely, but if you notice, it enabled the rule-making authority, the government, to prescribe the manner in which this credit can be carried forward. So now if you see the amendment which has been done to 9 subclauses of Section 140 by the Finance Act of 2020, Section 128 of the Finance Act of 2020, it inserts one more phrase before the word the manner prescribed, which is within such time. The effect of this amendment is that Section 140 now allows the rule-making authority to the government not only to prescribe the manner in which the credit will be carried forward, but also the time limit within which this credit will be carried forward. So this is the effect of the amendment. This is how the amendment reads now. It says that a person shall be allowed to carry forward under the existing credit under the existing law within such time and in such manner as may be prescribed. So the phrase within such time has been added. Now, what does this amendment achieve? This amendment will achieve something only if the virus of the rule 117, which we saw, which prescribes the time limit, is called into question on the basis that section 140, as it originally stood, did not enable the rulemaking authority to prescribe a time frame. In other words, the word in such manner prescribed does not include within it the time frame. If that is the understanding, then the legislature would have achieved something by incorporating this amendment, by enabling the rulemaking authority to fix time frame also under the statute itself. Therefore, it becomes necessary to look into the interpretation of the word the manner prescribed, which is what the rulemaking authority was originally empowered to do under section 140. Now, if you see, this phrase was dealt with directly by the Honorable Madras High Court in USA agencies, which was upheld by the Honorable Supreme Court in ALD Automotive in the context of section 1911 of the TN VAT Act, which prescribed a time frame for availing ITC under the TN VAT Act. Now, the Honorable Court interpreted the word in the manner prescribed under section 3.2 of the TN VAT Act, which was the main provision allowing the ITC. The Honorable High Court said we need not go into the question of whether the term in the manner prescribed includes time frame also, because the word in the manner prescribed is a procedural provision, whereas under the TN VAT Act, the time limit is prescribed under the main section 1911 itself. Therefore, the time limit is not procedural, it is substantive, and therefore we need not go into whether the term in the manner prescribed includes time frame also. The time limit was justified and upheld on the basis that it was a substantive condition and not a procedural condition. Unlike the Rule 117 of the GST Act, where the time limit is prescribed under the rule. Therefore, what will happen if the time limit is prescribed under the rule and the main act only uses the word in the manner prescribed? This is directly answered by the Honorable Supreme Court in the case of Sales Tax Officer versus K. Abraham, 1967-20 STC, where the question of time limit for filing C forms under the CST rules was in question. The rule was struck down because though section 8.4 of the CST Act allowed the rulemaking authority to prescribe the manner in which concessional rate can be availed, the manner in which C form can be filed, the Honorable Supreme Court held the word in the prescribed manner cannot take within its ambit time limit. It only talks of the form, the description of the commodities or etc. that will be mentioned in the forms, etc. It cannot take within its ambit the time limit. So if this judgment was to apply to Rule 117, clearly Rule 117 is ultra vires section 140, because section 140 as it originally stood did not allow the rulemaking authority to fix a time frame. It only allowed the rulemaking authority to prescribe the manner. So maybe to get over this decision or this principle, the legislature has now amended section 140 to prescribe the power to fix time limit in the main act itself and not leave it to come within the ambit in the prescribed manner. But there is a twist. Just 2 months back, the Honorable Bombay High Court has held that Rule 117 is valid, is not ultra vires section 140, because in spite of the K. Abraham's case, which was relied on by learned senior Mr. Sridharan, who has blessed us with presentations in the MTB on more than one occasion. He appeared for the petitioners in that case, in Nelco case. The Honorable Bombay High Court has held that the rule-making power for Rule 117 need not be traced to section 140, which only talks of the manner prescribed. It has to be traced to section 164(2) of the GST Act, which is the general rule-making power. The Bombay High Court distinguished the width of the rule-making power under the CST Act, which was considered in K. Abraham's case, and held that the rule-making power under section 164 of the GST Act is very wide. Therefore, it encompasses within itself the power to fix a time frame. So as per the decision of the Honorable Bombay High Court, section 164(2), which I have extracted, which is wide enough to include the time frame also, then Rule 117 is saved, irrespective of whether section 140 prescribes the power to fix a time limit or not. Then if this is the law as per the Bombay High Court, what is the need for amending section 140? If section 164(2) itself was sufficient, what is the need to amend 140? I must mention that the section was amended before the decision in ELCO, but it need not have been notified now. The department could have gone by the understanding in ELCO's case and held that it is not ultra vires. Section 164(2) itself is sufficient. So one is lost to understand as to why the department, why the government notified the amendment. Maybe it is not sure as to the correctness of the Bombay High Court decision regarding the virus of section 164(2), and as a matter of abundant caution, it wanted to prescribe the rule-making power for time frame under section 148. Now, we have looked at what the amendment seeks to achieve, whether it is ultra vires or no. Now we will look at the validity of the amendment itself. That is, what it achieves is one aspect. Whether it is valid at all on the principle that the legislature can remove the basis of a judicial decision, but it cannot encroach upon the judicial power. That is the principle of the Honorable Supreme Court, which I referred to. Now, going by that principle, is this amendment valid? To start, we have to necessarily understand the nature of transitional credit, which is contemplated under section 140. To understand that, we will look at two observations of courts regarding the nature of credit, which are apparently contradictory. One is the decision of the Honorable Supreme Court in Daiichi Karkaria, following Eicher Motors, etc., established case law under central excise, which say that credit is indefeasible. If I may just quote the first line, we are here, this is from Daiichi Karkaria 112 VLT, we are here concerned with credit that has been validly taken. The credit is therefore indefeasible. The Honorable Supreme Court, in light of credit that has already been validly taken under Senvat credit rules, holds that the credit is indefeasible and it is a vested right. But now look at the observation of the Honorable Madras High Court, which was upheld by the Honorable Supreme Court in USA agencies in the context of section 1911 time frame. It says, it can hardly be said that the right to claim ITC is a vested right or an indefeasible right. Now, how to reconcile these two observations regarding the nature of credit under the existing laws? This, according to me, was done precisely by the Delhi High Court in the latest decision, Brand Equities versus Union of India on 5th May of 2020, which I believe this amendment seeks to address. This amendment seeks to undo the effect of this decision. Now, the decision distinguishes the law in USA agencies, which I just referred to, which says that ITC is not a vested right. It is not indefeasible, by saying in the said case, which is the USA agencies case, in the said case, the input tax credit was not claimed. And thus, in these circumstances, the court concluded that the benefits envisaged in the taxing statute has to be extended as per restrictions, etc., etc. So it was in the context of ITC under the TN VAT Act, which had not even been claimed by the SSE. He had missed the timeline under section 1911. In that context, the Honorable Madras High Court and the Honorable Supreme Court upholding it held that ITC is a concession. It is not a vested right. However, I continue to read the Delhi High Court's decision. However, in the instant case, input credit had been claimed in the erstwhile regime and was being reflected in the Senvat credit ledger. This credit under section 140 has to be carried forward, and in that sense, vested right of the property of the petitioner. So the distinction is between credit that has already accrued or that has already been availed of by an SSE under the existing law, and a case of an SSE who has not availed it at all and who has not fulfilled the condition under the existing law at all. Here, since we are dealing with transitional credit, we are assuming, or it is understood, that the entire credit has already been availed of by the SSEs who are filing their Tran 1 forms. So in that sense, the Delhi High Court clearly holds that the issue is covered by the principle under Daiichi Karkaria, Eicher Motors, etc. And the transitional credit is a vested right. So in that light, we will have to now look at the validity of the time frame. Now, I must mention here that a contra view has been taken regarding the nature of transitional credit by the Bombay High Court itself, not in the context of Rule 117, which was what was dealt with in Brand Equities, which I referred to earlier, but in the context of Section 143, subclause 4 of the GST Act, which says that you are entitled to carry forward credit only with respect to stock that was available with you 1 year prior to the appointed date, 36/2016. Before that, if you had any stock and there was ITC for that stock, Senvat credit for that stock, you are not entitled to carry it forward. This provision was upheld when it was challenged by the Bombay High Court, saying that When Senvat Credit itself, Senvat Credit rules themselves could prescribe conditions for availing credit, why can't the GST Act prescribe conditions? Therefore, it was held that the transitional credit under GST Act is not a vested right. In my humble view, this judgment does not consider the principles in Daiichi Karkarya, Aikar Matters, etc. sufficiently, therefore may not be the correct law. And I must also mention that the same provision, section 143 subclause 4, was struck down by the Gujarat High Court subsequently, differing with the view of the Bombay High Court, holding that transitional credit is a vested right. So this I am just bringing to your attention for the completeness of the narration, but we should go by the latest law, latest decision of the court, of any high court, which is the decision in Brand Equities case, which holds transitional credit to be vested right, because it was already availed under the existing law. Now, before going into cases which struck down Rule 117 as being for taking away a vested right of transitional credit, we will look at two decisions which actually upheld the provision. Rule 117 was upheld by two courts as it is before the amendment to section 140, mainly on the ground of public interest. They did not delve deep into the issue of vested right being taken away by a subsequent law, etc., which was dealt with in Brand Equities and also in other decisions which I'll be referring to. They simply went by public interest. Two decisions: Willowwood Chemicals was Union of India, Gujarat High Court, and Nelco Limited was Union of India, which I referred to earlier in the context of the vires of Rule 117. Both these decisions uphold the validity of Rule 117 by saying, I will just read the Willowwood decision because it captures the essence of the principle. The second sentence: doing away with the time limit for making declarations could give rise to multiple large-scale claims tickering in for years together after the new tax structure is put in place. This would, besides making the task of matching credits impossible, also impact the revenue collection estimates. Therefore, the Honorable Court went by public interest and by convenience and did not go into the issue of vested right and constitutional rights, which were considered in other decisions. So also in the Nelco decision. Now we will look at the decision of the Gujarat High Court, which according to me is the most well-reasoned. It is the most elaborate and it is the most well-reasoned decision on this issue, on the issue of the validity of Rule 117. Rule 117 was held to be bad, was held to be unconstitutional by the Honorable Gujarat High Court. The time frame fixed under Rule 117 was held to be bad by the Gujarat High Court, not because Section 140 didn't empower the rulemaking authority to fix a time frame, but on four grounds. One, it held that transitional credit being a vested right, taking it away will amount to violation of Article 14. It amounts to violation of the doctrine of legitimate expectation. It is unreasonable. Second, it held that taking away Senvat or restricting the right to claim transitional credit will adversely affect the business or business capabilities of assessees, which in turn affects the right under Article 19(1)(g) of the Constitution of India. Third, the Honorable Gujarat High Court held that it will amount to double taxation. Taking away a vested right, taking away credit for tax duly paid by an assessee and asking him to pay again will amount to double taxation, and therefore it is arbitrary. Fourth, and this is where the amendment may have some role to play, the Honorable Gujarat High Court also held that transitional credit is a right to property under Article 300A of the Constitution, and a right under Article 300A can only be taken away by a statute, by a law laid down by Parliament and not by a rule. Now, this according to me was a passing observation and does not alter the position that taking away transitional credit by imposing a time limit violates Article 14, 19, etc. That is, those are independent grounds. Independently, the Honorable Gujarat High Court also says Article 300A right to property, which is the right to Senvat credit, cannot be taken away by a rule. Now, does this amendment cure this defect? Does the Amendment Act itself cure the defect with respect to Article 300A? In my view, no, we will look at that, but clearly the amendment aims to address this defect. Now, we will look at the validity of the amendment, like I said, will depend on whether the amendment takes away the basis of these decisions which I referred to. Now, before that, I'll also mention that Siddharth Enterprises has been followed by the Honorable Punjab and Haryana High Court in the case of Adford Technologies versus Union of India, and the SLP against Adford Technologies was dismissed by the Honorable Supreme Court. Therefore, technically, the Honorable Supreme Court has upheld the decision in Siddharth Enterprises. And following both these decisions, as I said, the latest decision of Brand Equities decided in May 2020, 5th May 2020, holds that Rule 117, the time frame under Rule 117 is only directory and not mandatory for 4 reasons. One, it follows the earlier decisions of Gujarat High Court and Punjab Haryana High Court and holds that transitional credit is a vested right. Second, it says the technical difficulties under Rule 117(1)(a), which allows the commissioner to extend time, should not be restricted to mean only technical difficulties in the portal. There could be various difficulties in the sphere of the assessee itself, bona fide difficulties. So technical difficulties should be viewed more expansively, is what the Delhi High Court says. Third, the Delhi High Court says Rule 117 time frame should be held to be directory and not mandatory because there is no consequence provided either under Section 140 or Rule 117 for failure to file the form within the time frame. Therefore, going by the established principles, when there is no consequence provided, automatically the provision becomes directory, of course, subject to exceptions. Finally, the Honorable Delhi High Court says is that we agree that this does not mean that there can be no time frame at all. So we feel that the Limitation Act time frame of 3 years for making a claim is a reasonable time frame. Therefore, as per the Delhi High Court judgment, the time frame under Rule 117 should be read to mean 3 years from the appointed day, which means it is expiring in July 2020, 1 month from now. Now, the question is, does the amendment take away the basis of these judgments? Or does it violate this judgment? Does it encroach upon the judicial power? In which case, the amendment has to be struck down. For this, I rely on a decision of the Honorable Supreme Court in the case of State of Karnataka was Karnataka Pawnbrokers Association, where the issue was the Karnataka Pawnbrokers Associations Act provided for a security deposit for pawnbrokers to get a license, a security deposit. But there was no provision for interest while refunding the security deposit when the license was cancelled. The Honorable Karnataka High Court had already held that since the Act doesn't bar interest on refund, it should be held to be given, it should be held to be available or provided under the Act because it is reasonable. It is unreasonable to say you will have a deposit without interest. Therefore, the Karnataka High Court held that since there is no provision in the Karnataka Act denying interest, interest should be given while refunding the security deposit. Now, to undo this judgment, the Karnataka government brought in an amendment enabling provision to deny the interest on refund. This amendment was challenged. The Honorable Supreme Court struck down the amendment by saying this. I want to read the last 3 lines. The court had observed, this is referring to the Karnataka High Court decision earlier, that even if such a provision prohibiting payment of interest had been there in the statute, such provision would be illegal. Therefore, there was no error pointed out by the court which could have been corrected by the legislature. In other words, would the presence of this amendment which has now been made any difference to the dicta or the principles laid down in the Siddharth Enterprise judgment, Adford Technologies and Brand Equities judgment? Would it have? If it does not, then it does not take away the basis and the amendment is bad in law. In my view, it does not take away the basis because if transitional credit is held to be a vested right and taking it away amounts to violation of Article 14 and 19, it doesn't matter whether the provision is there in the rule or in the act. It is still bad in law. It is still unconstitutional. So the fact that the provision is now there in the main statute itself may not make a difference to the law laid down by these high courts that a time limit fixed of 90 days is unconstitutional as it takes away a vested right. Now, finally, as I mentioned, there was an observation in the Gujarat High Court decision that Article 300A right can only be taken away by law and not by rule. And therefore, maybe this rule, this amendment is brought in to bring in the time frame within the Act itself. In my view, that may not cure the defect, because as the Honorable Supreme Court held in KT Plantation v. State of Karnataka, where Land Reforms Act was challenged, for a law to be valid when it takes away the right to property under Article 300A, it has to provide a provision for compensation. Now, the Honorable Supreme Court says in circumstances, the compensation may be nil also, but still there has to be a provision for compensation. Here, when the Act now allows the rulemaking authority to prescribe a time frame to take away transitional credit or to deny the right to transitional credit, there is no corresponding provision for compensation for loss of the transitional credit. So even by bringing it in the main statute, it will not make it a valid law under Article 300A. So in my view, on all these grounds, this amendment is vulnerable to challenge. I may be wrong. There may be other points of view. I'm waiting to listen to see if there are ways in which this amendment can be justified in toto. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, everybody. Now over to Joseph, sir.
Yes, sir. I'm just.
Thank you, Aditya. A wonderful presentation. You've touched upon all the aspects, and in fact, coming to that last, your reference to this Karnataka Pawnbroker Association, the Supreme Court said there was nothing illegal which was pointed out, and there was no scope for correction by the legislature. There was nothing wrong. So the provision as it stood before the challenge did not have any flaw. Therefore, by the legislature trying to insert something additionally for the first time was held to be bad in law. This is precisely the same principle which has been held in the Refex case, section 50, interest by our Madras High Court, where the Honorable Judge said that whether, of course, after that, this was told in the court, whether proviso is there or not, whether proviso has been notified or not, the legislature per se did not have power to levy interest on 50 unless adjudication was done. So I think this Supreme Court decision is very, very pertinent to. Then on the US agencies vis-a-vis the K. Abraham Supreme Court decision, the term manner interpreted by the Supreme Court to say that the term manner prescribed will not include within its fold power to prescribe time. So therefore, if it merely says manner prescribed and if time limit is not prescribed, then the Supreme Court went on to hold that there is no time limit at all. Time limit can't be introduced through a rule. That is very clear. Now, US agencies is slightly different because the section 1901 versus 1911, the section itself provided for time limit. Therefore, in that context, Madras High Court held that it is valid. That is perfectly fine. And now, if you see, again, our Honorable Madras High Court had an occasion to deal with Rule 18 of the Central Excise Rules relating to rebate of duty on export, where the condition prescribed was, or where the rule read as, where any goods are exported, the central government by my notification grant rebate of duty, so and so, so and so, and the rebate shall be, I stop here, the rebate shall be subject to such conditions or limitations, comma, if any, comma, and fulfillment of such procedure as may be specified in the notification. Then the notification is issued prescribing time limit. For some time, there's no time limit, some other time. Then this also cannot be, in this case, the darkest market maker, the landmark judgment, which went to Supreme Court, SLP by the department was dismissed. the Honorable Madras High Court, the plea was whether time limit would apply or not. So the term conditions, limitations, and such procedure is all pervasive. If this were to be there in 140, maybe there is an escape route for the government or for the department. But merely saying manner prescribed, you will have to necessarily fall back upon the Supreme Court decision K. Abraham, and that has to prevail over US agencies, because US agencies is in a different context altogether. Similarly, Rule 5, refund of seminar credit, also has the following, it says refund of seminar credit. That also says subject to procedure, safeguards, conditions and limitations. So if you make a comparison of manner prescribed per se, vis-a-vis the elaborate terms used as procedure, safeguards, conditions, limitations, I think the USA agencies, I don't think will saving 140. So I think you have done an extremely good job, and hats off to you. Good, excellent, Aditya. I'll just now go over to my presentation. Yeah, this is on section 16.2. I'll just share the screen first. Yeah, the full screen is coming now, no?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Can I proceed now?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So again, good evening to everyone now. This is a slightly different topic, which I thought I should do it. I'm going to deal only with section 16.2 and the 4 conditions prescribed therein. Just a comparison or analysis to probably get to know what is the meaning of a particular term used in a particular subclass in subsection 2 of section 16. So what I will do, I'll just run through section 16 first, just for the understanding, and then come over to subsection 2 and subclass D. Now, this is the verbatim reproduction of section 16. I can't get it in one screen, so it will come in 2-3 slides now. So this is not so relevant to except to say that section 16.1 says every registered person liable to, he will be entitled to take the input tax credit. Fair enough. There's nothing, no controversy or ambiguity here. Then subsection 2 says no registered person will be entitled to any ITC unless. So if you see here, there are 2 negatives used, no and unless. So it's like saying a registered person will be entitled to take subject to the following 4 conditions. So the conditions actually follow. Again, this is mere reproduction. Now subclass A says he is in possession of tax invoice. Fair enough. So I am the recipient, I am the buyer, I am the registered person, I am availing tax, I am availing the input tax credit. So what should I do? I must have the tax invoice. So services rendered, but invoice not raised. Probably I will not be eligible. So the first and foremost requirement, like the duty paying document under the central excise service tax. So I must have a tax invoice. Yes. Then physically I must receive the goods if it is goods. Of course, I must also receive the services if it is services. So possession of invoice, receipt of goods / services. These 2 are conditions precedent for me to avail. Then please note, subclass 2 has an explanation which has 2 parts. I'm not going into that because it's not so relevant. The explanation will get merged into the second subclass, receipt of goods. So therefore, for the limited purpose of discussion on a particular point today, I'm leaving out the explanation. Then we come to C. Now if you look at A, B, or A and B together, there is a word, he is in possession, he has received. It starts with the person specific, these two subclasses. If you come to C, it is not person specific, it is some activity specific. It says subject to the provisions of subsection 2 of, section 41 or section 43A. This 2 actually should not be there. It was an amended to include 43A. 43A, again, I'm not discussing, or not been notified as yet. So you'll read it as subject to the provisions of section 41. The tax charged should have been actually paid to the government, obviously by the supplier, cash or ITC, doesn't matter. Then it says and, it closes and then starts with the last word is and. C ends with and. And then it goes on to say, he has furnished the return under section 39. Now I'm going to discuss only on this subclass D. He has furnished the return under section 39. I don't want to discuss D now. I'll take you through the other provisos and the other two subsections in 16 before I come back to D. Now D says he has furnished a return. Now we'll go to, now 2 starts with unless somebody has fulfilled 4 conditions, they will not be able to avail the credit. Fine, fair enough. There are 4 conditions. Then the 4 conditions are followed by 3 provisos. Proviso 1, 2, 3. Again, I don't want to discuss very elaborately on this. This again, the first proviso is equivalent to the central excise procedure. Suppose a machine is dismantled and then sent in 5-6 container trucks or whatever. Then you have to wait for the last container, which brings you the last lot of the goods. Avail the credit only after receipt of the entire lot. Then of course, if you don't pay within 180 days, you are liable to pay tax or reverse the ITC. Fair enough. Then it says re-availing the credit. Again, no questions about that. So there are 3 provisos which are common to subsection 2, which are again nothing but conditions in the form of nomenclature of provisos. Now I come to subsection 3 and 4. Subsection 3 says depreciation. Of course, again, I'm not going into that. He said this subsection will say if you're availing depreciation on the tax component, capital goods, then don't take the credit. You're not entitled. Fair enough. Then 4 says the time limit. Again, we are not into that. Okay. Now this is how the section reads. Now I go back to subclass D of subsection 2 of section 16. The term he has furnished the return under section 39. Now the question is, I'll just I'll take you through 16 again in this thing. So it's 16 with all 4 conditions put together reads like this. He is in possession of tax invoice. He has received the goods. Tax charged should have been paid. Then he has furnished return. Now if you look at this subsection 2, the term he is used in A, B and D. Now the question is, what is who does the law refer to as he under subsection or subclass D? An immediate or probably the popular reaction has always been probably that A refers to the recipient buyer, B also refers to the buyer. So therefore D also should refer to the buyer. I mean, this prima facie looks a convincing submission or argument until or unless you look at it a little closely. Now, the legislature used the word he in A, B and D. So naturally there are 4 conditions to subsection 2 of 16. And this last subsection says, the subclass says, he has furnished the return. So therefore the condition to be fulfilled, the last condition under 16.2 is the recipient should have filed return under 39. 39 return is originally Form GSTR 3, and now of course 3B temporarily, I don't know, temporarily has been going on for the last 3 years now. So 3B. So unless and until that he has filed return in Form GSTR 3B, the conditions are not fulfilled. Now, I'm just taking you through the provision again to say, what does he mean? That is, the term he refers to the recipient buyer who avails ITC. I mean, me. I'm placing myself in the position of the recipient. Is the term he the same as in section A and B? Now, as I said, the popular perception or the school of thought is that he refers to the recipient and the recipient alone, because it is the same term is found in A, B as also in D. But I feel that that may not be the correct position because there's some subtle difference. Now, if you see, there is a lot of importance given sometimes. The comma, full stop, semicolon, colon, they become crucial for interpretation of tax laws. So I've just extracted the legal dictionary meaning of semicolon. Or how does it work? It says semicolon will have two purposes. One is to separate lengthy or complex items within a list and to connect independent classes. These are the two. So there'll be some standalone lengthy or complex sentence or a condition. Maybe there is one more, but these two to be together fulfilled, each one may be on a standalone basis to be tested, but both to be fulfilled for some other reason. In that respect, the semicolon is used, and this has been, I have read through some of the decisions of the Supreme Court, our Madras High Court and 1921 Madras High Court decision, all of that relating to semicolon and all that. All these decisions uniformly say semicolon is crucial and it is powerful than comma. If it is mango, probably orange and apple, they may use the word comma. If it is something more like a sentence, probably then there is a need to use the semicolon and colon. This is what is the meaning of semicolon. Now, with this in the background, I will take you through 16.2. Now, this is again the verbatim extract of section 16.2 conditions. First condition says he is in possession of a tax invoice or debit note, so and so, whatever, as may be prescribed. Please note, A ends with the, then B starts. It says he has received the goods or services or both, and there is a full stop. Therefore, what starts with the semicolon ends with the full stop. These two conditions under section 16.2 A and B, these are a separate species in itself. There is a full stop. Therefore, like the Central Sales Tax Act, there is a termination of movement which happens. So there is a termination of the conditions here. It stops with B. Now, if you look at C, it's a little different. If you had to look at 2, subsection 2, unless, notwithstanding anything contained, unless no registered person, unless, if you read that unless with condition A, it reads well. Unless he is in possession, unless he has received. The English or the grammar or the flow of the language is perfect. But if you come to C, unless subject to, it doesn't make sense, but it remains like that. If you look at C, it says, so the provisions of 2 is not to be there, to be deleted. Subject to the provision of section 41, the tax charge should be actually paid. And please note, C ends with a semicolon again. And succeeded by and, the word and. If you look at A, there is a semicolon at the end. B, there is a full stop. If you come to C again, there is a semicolon. And D, if you see, he has already returned, there is a colon. That means the first conditions are a separate standalone conditions be read together, there happens a termination or a completion. There are all conditions under section 16.2. Still, subclass C and D have to be read independent of A and B only with respect to interpretation of the word he. I am not saying just because it is the full stop is there, he will mean the recipient or the supplier. No, I'm not trying to say that. I'm only trying to say the argument that A, B, C, D, A, B and C, D have he. Therefore, the he and D will also mean, will have to mean only what is meant in A and B. That argument is broken, or that argument will not sustain. With that, now I am convinced that you will have to have a fresh look at the term he under D in order to find out who does the term he mean, whether the supplier or the recipient or the buyer. I'm again saying the argument that A, B and D to be seen together cannot sustain for the reason that there is a semicolon in A followed by a full stop in B, and there is a D which starts, C which starts with semicolon, ends with semicolon in D, to be followed by 3 provisos, each of which is semicolon only, and the third proviso stops with a full stop. Then starts subsection 3. Now, what does the word he signify or connote? Now you will examine. You will have to presume 2 situations hypothetically. The term he, suppose it means the recipient as per the popular perception or school of thought. The term he would mean the recipient or the registered person has furnished return in form GSTR 3B. This is what it should read as. The recipient or the taxpayer registered person should have filed or should file return in form GSTR 3B. Now, don't you think that I'm the person I'm going to avail the credit? How can I ever claim the credit, utilize the credit, unless I file 3B? So is this not stating the obvious? What is meant by 3B? 3B is nothing but a return. In that return, all of the information is captured. So I just take you through 39 now. 39.1 says, for read with rule 61, GSTR 3B, it says a registered person. I'm only reading the bold portion which is highlighted. For every calendar month, the furnisher return inward and outward supplies, or both. Furnisher return electronically of inward and outward supply, which means 3B will contain, obviously it contains all of which I procure, all of that which I supply, the input credit availed, the input credit availed, I emphasize ITC availed, tax payable, tax paid, that is okay, not relevant to the discussion. So therefore, what is that I have received? How much of the credit are availed? I have to obviously state that in form 3B. So form 3B has to be filed, there's no doubt about that. Now, if the intention of the parliament or legislature were to say that the recipient should file form GSTR 3B, even otherwise, how would the recipient or the buyer ever take the credit and utilize it without going through GSTR 3B? It's stating the obvious, absolutely obvious, no doubt about that. Now I'll take you through subsection 3. I'll read that again. Subject to the provisions of, the 2 is extra, that to be deleted. Subject to the provisions of section 41, the tax charge in respect of such supply has been actually paid. So this condition is no doubt onerous. I'm not on that. There's no second opinion about I don't have any second opinion. I don't have any second view or to say that this condition is onerous. The recipient, in order to avail the tax ITC, should ensure that the supplier has paid. This is a condition precedent. This condition is onerous. Independently challenged, no doubt about that. I'm not on that at all. I'm only saying as this law stands today, there is a condition that I should ensure that tax is paid at the other end. Under the VAT, it got stuck down. That's a different thing. So therefore, there is a condition that the recipient, in order to avail, has to ensure that the tax is paid. Now, if you read and, he has furnished. Now, what is the implication of, if you read the he as the supplier of the goods or the services, supplier, let's say suppliers of goods. These, I will read D as the supplier has furnished the return in form GSTR 3B. Now, what is the implication if he has filed GSTR 3B? What is the implication if he has not filed GSTR 3B? Now, the law compels me to ensure that tax is paid at the other end. They don't stop. They feel it is not so onerous. They want to have an further additional, even more onerous condition to say the recipient, in order to avail the credit, should not only ensure that the supplier pays the tax, he should also ensure that he has furnished the return. Or I won't say ensure, I will say that the eligibility will crystallize only upon the supplier filing the return in form GSTR 3B. What does it mean? What if the supplier who supplies goods to me pays the tax probably, and I have complied with 3 but not complied with D? That supplier has not filed 3B. When he will not file 3B? Obviously, when he may probably sell, he may have a sale of, let's say he has got 5 transactions in the month of January. 10 lakhs, 20 lakhs, 30 lakhs, 40 lakhs and 50 lakhs. My supply is for 50 lakhs. He has paid 18% GST. I am eligible to avail. It is reflected in probably whatever 2A. I have the invoice. I have received the goods. He has also confirmed it paid. It is getting reflected. There's no problem. But he has not filed the return. What could be the possible reason if he has not filed? The reason is he might have paid 50 lakhs, 18%, probably, you know, the amount of about 9 lakhs GST. But he may not have paid the entire tax for all of his supplies, which may work out about 1 crore and 10 lakhs. On 18%, he may not have paid. He may probably short paid. If he is short paid, you are aware that he can't file a 3B. So the law is absolutely onerous. Again, I'm saying, I'm not trying to justify the provision, whether D or C. I'm only saying the law envisages the recipient to make sure that tax is paid at the other end, and they don't stop with that. They also say that I must ensure that return also as well, which means he complies with the law fully, which means the supplier has to pay tax on all of his supplies and then comply fully with filing 3B. So this is what is meant by the intention of the legislature. Now, if you read he with substituting the word he as supplier, it will make sense. And read in conjunction with C, tax paid to ensure actual payment of tax on the supply and furnishing of return by the supplier. So therefore, the he has to mean the supplier and supplier only. Now, if you look at C, I said if the legislature were to say the supplier, the recipient has to file 3B, I said it is stating the obvious. I will now substantiate my argument with that by going to 41. Now, please note 16(2)(c) says subject to 41. Subject to 41, I am not reading 43A, not notified, as 16(2)(c) originally introduced, and till it stands to how it stands till today, it is only 41. 43 I'm ignoring for a minute. If you go through 41, it says every registered person shall, subject to such conditions and restrictions as may be prescribed, be entitled to take the credit. Please note, be entitled to take the credit. Take the credit, avail of ITC as self-assessed, fair enough, in his return. That is registered person's return. There is no need for any interpretation of the word his to mean whether supplier or the recipient. It is the registered person, it is me, the recipient only. And such amount shall be credited, provisional basis, fair enough. Now come to subclass 2, 41 subsection 2, it says, the credit referred to in section 1, which means the credit which I have taken the credit which I have taken provisionally shown in my return, I will be allowed to utilize it only for payment of output tax as per the return referred to in subsection. Now, if you look at sections 37, 38, 39, 37 and 38 will talk about details to be furnished. Form GSTR 1, 2A is of auto-populated. All of that will only, they are all referred to as details which are declared to the department. 39 uses the word return. 3/3B alone. 3B alone is the return. So therefore, subsection 2 of 41 says a recipient who's probably complied with 16 in full will be eligible to utilize only as per my 3B. Therefore, Bihar's section 16(2)(d), which in the eventuality of meaning the recipient, which can't meet the recipient can never come, even if it assuming, if it had to mean the recipient, there is a specific section which refers specifically to ITC, which specifically refers to the return, which says I can utilize only after as per the GSTR 3B file. Therefore, return filing or filing of return under in form GSTR 3(3)B is fully taken care of, provided for, completed, closed in section 41. Therefore, the reference to the term he in to mean recipient will only become redundant and not relevant at all. So therefore, when section 41 clearly means the return 3B, where is the need again to say 16(d) that I must file the return? Again, therefore, if you look at this in this manner, I would like to conclude that the term he will only mean the supplier and the supplier only, not the recipient. So with this, I just close the session, and we'll open it for question answers. Yeah.
Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah.
So I see a first question coming from Natarajan, sir. I'll just unmute him. I'll unmute Nitin and Aditya Reddy, sir.
Yeah. Now, actually, the whoever has any questions relating to the presentation made by Nitin Chopra and Aditya may ask questions, as also the section 16. So Nitin and Aditya also will also give any reply if required. I will also do that.
So I have just unmuted all of you, sir.
Okay.
So participant, whoever is asking question, you can specify from whom you want an answer, and then later on, either Joseph sir or Nitin or Aditya sir can supplement to it. Okay, sir? Is that fine, sir? No, whoever wants to ask a question can specify who they're asking the question to who, and after that, others can supplement if required, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. First question is from Natarajan, sir. I'm unmuting him. Natarajan, sir.
Yeah, this is to Joseph. First, your discussion on whether he means which he. It was like our Nityananda's me talk. He, who is that he, and he was the he, and he is that he. It was like that. Very interesting. And coming to Switzerland, I think you are the one who argued before Kerala High Court also that particular case. And this particular question is in a little lighter vein, not a serious question. So as we all know, most of the decisions of the Advanced Ruling Authority are in favor of revenue. And that is a hard fact which we have to accept. Had that being the so, why are you so adamant that the Advanced Ruling Authority should hear you? And now you got a High Court order and now you go before an Advanced Ruling Authority. And do you think that that authority will do justice to you? This is a little lighter vein.
No, I take your question fully. In fact, in my presentation on GSTR Advanced Ruling a few weeks earlier, I started off my presentation by saying there is enormous amount of adverse publicity on AR. Still, there are some positive aspects. I started like that. Now, if you look at the Sutherland case specifically, 97 2 order was passed. 98 2 order was passed. We had no other go. You can't go to AR. Remediless, as Nitin Chopra rightly said. So therefore, our only way out was to go to the High Court. So in fact, the only submission which I made was, after going in for a number of days, I said either this court has to decide that the authority has erred in saying that no scope. If you say that, I'm happy because I'm remediless, I can't go to AAR. The High Court has to then decide the issue on merits. The moment I said that, the judge was very clear that he will not go into the merits. So he had to find a way out to say that advanced ruling authority, of course, rightly, there's no questions about that, except for what Mr. Gokarnesan said in that subject to that, I think a question which is incidental to the determination of tax, I think should fall under the scope of AR. Maybe not a standalone question on place of supply. Anyway.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Sir, next question I'll take from Aparna.
Excellent
Aparna,
presentation. Yeah, excellent presentation by Nitin, Aditya. Joseph, I don't have to say anything about you. You're, as usual, excellent, fantastic.
Thank you.
Nitin, just one thing I wanted to add. Your presentation was excellent. Didn't look like a maiden performance at all. Fantastic. Very good research. Just one thing, you were talking about the challenge to the advanced ruling authority, isn't it? Recent challenge. Just one information which I just wanted to add. See, even before our Madras High Court, the provisions have been challenged. And the provisions were also challenged before the Gujarat High Court and Rajasthan High Court. So what the central government did, that they filed transfer petition before the Honorable Supreme Court. And Supreme Court has granted stay on those transfer petitions. Therefore, the High Courts are not right now taking up the matter. So once the transfer petition is decided, probably we'll have to see, we'll have to wait for the outcome. So that is an additional information which I wanted to share. Fantastic. And Aditya, excellent presentation. You have beautifully given out the difference between where the vested right will come in. It's very nice. Avail credit and utilize credit. Fantastic.
Thank you, madam. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you. I was not aware of the transfer petition. Like after you said.
That's okay. That's okay. That's why I'm sharing this information.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Next question is from JK sir. I think he wanted to ask the question to Aditya sir. 1 minute. JK sir.
Yes. First, my congratulations to Joseph. In fact, it's amazing. You have taken up two great stallions, I have to tell you. And it was a fantastic presentation. Honestly, to confess, it beat many of our presentations, I have to tell. That Aditya Reddy, I was spellbound. Not to flatter you, you were absolutely wonderful. Of course, I know about my colleague, he'll do wonders. But you were, class. Okay, now I'll come to the question, Aditya.
Thank you.
See, you were right that a vested right, in fact, Natarajan in one of his webinars also said that whatever is accrued to me, I'm carrying it over. That is what he answered once. And I'm also on the same page with you. But most of the disputes on Tran 1 is not about the 141 or 2. Because 141 or 2 is an automatically, nobody wants to miss it because it is through the return. Capital goods, inputs, input services, everything got transmitted well within the time. Maybe the initial, I would say that even people didn't wait for December. It was all done in the first installment itself. It was properly carried. Now, most of the disputes are only about 143. Where it was not, the transmission was not through the instrument, that either through your returns of ER1 or ST3 or whatever, what is it? Now, the dispute was all only to 143. Now, my question to you would be, how do you say that 143 will be a vested right Why? Because 143 deals with a situation where it is about you have a stock, you have an invoice, and you are taking for the first time. It is not that you have already taken and it is being transmitted. 143, my understanding is, and when all the legacy laws or your S2I law itself had, that is what you very rightly read out from the Bombay judgment, that there itself there was a limitation. GST is not to allow you or extend you a time limitation which was originally prescribed. So when the original law itself had a restriction of only 1 year, now how 3 years extension? Is this not a subsidy? Is it not giving you an incentive? That maybe if 1 year is the time limit from the date of that you have to take it, I agree with you. Maybe I will not be agreeing to the first installment which happened in July, August, August I believe, thereafter to December. Maybe to July is fine. But extending it 3 years, is it not, what is it, the earlier, is it not defeating the equity that earlier guys had only 1 year limitation when they were in excise service tax? Now they are giving 3 years, and 143 is something which is you had a stock and you had an invoice, so take it within 1 year. Is it not correct? Is it a vested right?
I understand, sir. Two things. The first, this 143, sir, we had discussed yesterday also when we were doing a mock presentation. You are right, sir, that first time, I don't think any of the decisions which hold them to be a vested right considered a claim under 143. They were all referring to availed credit that a registered person under the existing law who had his credit under the excise laws or VAT laws who was taking it forward. So a person who is first time who is making a claim, whose formalities are prescribed in the GST law only for the first time, then you are absolutely right, sir. I don't think he can take the benefit of this decision and say that it is a vested right under 143. I think, but honestly, sir, you like you mentioned, I don't know the ratio of the volume of cases between both. That is, I think from what you are saying, a lot of cases may actually be coming from 143 only. In that sense, this discussion may be academic also. Sorry if I'm not wrong from what you're saying. But if you look at all the decisions, sir, the Delhi High Court and Gujarat High Court, they were all claims under 141, where persons had already availed of credit under the NVAT rules. Now, the second question, sir, the 1 year time limit that you mentioned under the Central Excise and Service Law, what exactly was it for, if I may ask, sir? If I can just, you can just clarify.
There was also a time limit that in NVAT credit regime, that you can take credit only within 1 year from the date of the invoice. That was there in the, correct me if I'm wrong, Natarajan.
Yes, sir, correct, sir. That is similar to VAT. Now somebody has availed it, sir, within 1 year. Then what happens to him? That is now the question is, that is what is considered, sir. Under the existing law, you have fulfilled all the requirements and you have claimed it within 1 year. It has come to your credit ledger in the Central Excise
Absolutely,
law.
I'm with
Now,
you.
how can you take it away by a sub?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So that may be your. Yes, sir. Now,
very good.
That is where I think, sir, that Bombay High Court in JCB says when Central Excise law itself, you could impose conditions.
Exactly.
Why can't
you?
Yes, sir. Sir, the only thing is, the correct way is for the department to take all this to the Supreme Court and settle the matter once and for all as to whether it's a vested right or no. Not by bringing in such an amendment is what I feel.
And lastly, I have to tell you this: your wonderful presentation. The concession now you made for 143 that there could be a possibility made it even more wonderful.
Thank you, sir.
That is grace. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I think at this point, Raghavan sir also wants to add something. Raghavan sir.
Yes. Am I audible?
Yes, Raghavan. Your views are very eagerly awaited.
No, I was on this.
I'm taking a deviation from the popular this thing. So anyway, please go on.
I was adding to JK sir's question and Aditya's reply on the same topic.
Yes.
It will still remain. I understand the difference between 140 subsection 3 and the 140 subsection 1. I see that difference, but still, for it being a vested right, the events which will trigger the, or rather enable you to take the credit, that has happened well within the time. Only bringing it in the transition return because of the problems we had, only that is delayed. So therefore, won't it still remain as a vested right is my question, because non-availment of the credit is not attributable to any of the factors which will enable you for the credit. All those things have happened within time. Unlike rule 4.1 or 4.7 of the S2L Senate credit rules, where the time delay could be because of my delay in taking the credit in the return, where I was also eligible. But here, the delay in not taking in the return or in the transition thing may not be necessarily because of your lapse. Under the old regime, the delay in taking in not taking it is purely your lapse. But here it is not like that. So therefore, can this be seen? It's basically a question. Can this be seen differently from 4.1 and 4.7, and still can we take umbrage under the vested right argument? Was my question.
I will come once again. You're right, yes, Raghavan. When I opened up also itself, I said that 1 year should be given from the date of transition, that is on 1st July, till 1st July of 2018. Even I am at the same page with you.
No, sir. What I'm asking is, why
I'll amplify. No. What I'm saying is, if there is going to be because of a technical, there are so many issues which cropped up because of the technical goof up, because of the all these things have been already addressed by the High Courts, and they have given, they have opened up the gates, and even department accepted, and I think there was a extension of time given if it is on account of a technical glitch. That technical glitch or a very genuine mistake, not from our end, is not what I was proposing, because that has been already dealt. High Courts have given concession, and even department has accepted, I believe. They went up to every April, they extended it. Now we are only talking about non-technical glitches, where you have, by this current judgment, where it has been increased by 3 years. I was just saying that when the erstwhile law itself, as you rightly said, all your other parameters are to the T, then even then, 1 year was the time limit even then. So maybe July 18 could have been a possible. Of course, we have crossed that. That is what I was telling. Not on the account of, the department's failure or technical
glitches. Yes, sir. I understand your point on you, as you started initially also, that people under the old regime had only 1 year, now you have 3 years.
Exactly.
I understood that point.
Right.
But will it have an impact on vested right? Because on 1/7/2017, that old law of 1 year ceased to exist, after which there is no time limit at all. In the absence of time limit, if 3 years is prescribed, discrimination is other thing, but won't it still be a vested right, was my question.
No, in this new law, only 143 they have provided for. That is why they came ulta. They said that your invoice should be within 1 year, something like that they brought. 140, I think Aditya read.
Yes.
Raghavan,
yes.
I differ from you. See, subsection 3 of 140, when it is bound with so many conditions, do you still think that it is a vested right?
No, the conditions have to be satisfied. Conditions have to be satisfied.
Sure. But, academically speaking, let's not go into the who's appearing for associate and for the department.
Of course not.
But yes, but when it is bound with so much of conditions and it is available for the first time, do you still think that it is a vested right? Don't you think that the decisions in JM & Co. and USA will apply? See, I'm not talking about section 141 for this, for a moment. See, 141 is a different code by itself. But 140
I will answer this. I'm sorry to Aditya. I will just answer this and I will stop. Sir, madam, every time, every credit comes with some conditionality. And when the conditions remain to be satisfied, it is never a right at all. That is what JM is about, JM and all these judgments, because there was a condition not satisfied. before the condition getting satisfied, I cannot claim any vested right. But let there be plethora of conditions, let there be 1,000 conditions. If I satisfy all those conditions, after that, is it not a vested right? So therefore, condition attached, condition not attached. So long as I have satisfied the condition, that time it accrued to me, and we are only on the time limit. And if the time limit gets extended, subject to all other conditions being satisfied, why can't we still call it a vested right is my question.
I'll just add only one point to this, sir. See, between 141 and 143, these two stand on different footing. The concept of vested right, Aditya, which decision they said elaborately about that? When the court came to the conclusion that it is a vested right, see, the vested right is 141 situation is, I'm a manufacturer. I am in the business for the last 10, 20 years, whatever. Keep receiving input, raw material, consumables, capital goods, all of that. I avail the credit, get the invoice like section 16(2). I fulfill number of conditions there, receive, take the invoice, make the payment, then show it in the return. Unless I show it in the return, that credit is never there. All of that I've done. Then the GST is introduced. Then there is some probably lapse on my part to have complied with the transaction provision. Therefore, on 30/6/2017, not on 1st, please note that one day will make all the difference. On 30th June, I have a vested right in that amount. So therefore, the court came to the conclusion that it is vested right. Now look at a person who is a dealer. He is a dealer. We will only pass on the credit. He is not going to take the credit. So, or an unregistered dealer who has only purchased. They have never been taking SENVAT credit, but excise duty paid invoices they have. So they become eligible upon GST because GST is imposing a condition that I have to pay 18%. All along I was paying only at 4%. Now if I'm asked to pay 18% on the sale of the stock which is there lying, and if they impose condition that within 1 year I should have purchased, get it certified, whatever, and then take it into this thing, though no doubt 141 is on a superior different footing, 140 also after the conditions are imposed and fulfilled by me, a typical unregistered dealer under central excise, so the trader, he will get a vested right not because he has complied with the filing return and all that, because an obligation is cast on him post GST. Therefore, it is vested right. You can't punish me there and then also punish me here for a lapse. So in that respect, though 141, I have vested right for different reasons. 143, I have vested right for a completely different reason.
Okay. I have one doubt. Can I ask?
Sir, I'm just sorry to interrupt. Sir, can we, I think on this point, there are many people who want to add on points. So my request is, can I just take up one or two quick questions in between, because participants are leaving, I believe. Then we can have a continuous discussion on this point.
My next question is a different point. So therefore, I will mute myself. You can take other questions.
Just 2 minutes, sir. We'll finish that and come back.
Please unmute Mr. Vishwanathan. No, I think he wants to.
Sir, Vishwanathan sir also has a point in this same discussion only. So can we just take up this entire discussion at the end? I'll unmute everyone.
Yes.
Whoever wants to add on. So thank you very much, sir, for your permission. I'll just take up one or two questions. Sir, I believe those participants have left. Any other questions participants wants to ask? Or we can just continue with the current discussion itself. If there's any other questions, you can just drop me a message immediately or just raise a hand. I'll just unmute Lakshmanan sir. I think he has something else to say. And after that, we can continue with this discussion. Lakshmanan sir?
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
It was a very good, interesting viewpoint from you. I have only one clarification I want. Whether ACFAT, is it a reasoned judgment or not reasoned judgment?
Which one?
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, which one is?
Hello.
Yeah, you are audible, Lakshman. Please go on.
This is to Aditya.
Yeah.
Hello, Aditya. Are you able to listen to me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Tell me, sir.
Yeah, it was a nice presentation with a very good, nice, interesting viewpoint. Only question is, ACFET, was it a recent judgment or without reason?
Sir, it was in November 2019, sir, and SLP was dismissed in February.
No, whether it was a reasoned one or unreasoned one.
Reasoned, well reasoned, and it relies substantially on Siddharth Enterprises. Reasoned.
Okay.
It relies substantially on Siddharth Enterprises and many other decisions.
Siddharth actually gave. Siddharth
SLP is the only. SLP is dismissal, sir. Dismissal.
Thank you. Thanks.
Lakshman, Siddharth is the reason for the birth of that amendment to 140.
Yeah.
Like, manufacture, then clearance happened.
Yeah.
Brand equity.
Yeah.
So brand equity prompted them to notify it immediately.
To you, Joseph.
Pardon?
To you, only one observation. I think there is one more condition that the invoice amount should also be paid. I don't exactly recollect the provision.
No, that is section 16.3 is there. No, I read that out, discussed also.
Invoice
180 days.
I think it is an interlocking procedure, not the seller paying the ITC or anything. There should not be an outstanding amount between the seller and the buyer.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't.
16.3 says.
I don't exactly recollect the provision.
Yeah.
And one more thing is, as you say, rightly said, it is an interlocking provision only. 16(2)(d) is an interlocking provision which ensures. Otherwise, as you say, it can be deemed as a onerous. If you recall, under Form 17, there were decisions where the seller, the purchaser, whatever the default on the other side cannot be taken against the seller.
Yeah, correct.
Whether the Form 17, the purchaser utilizes it for not for the said purpose.
Second proviso to section 16D talks about payment within 180 days. Failure to do so, you'll have to reverse the credit. Yes.
So it is a very stringent condition only.
Yes.
All the three taken together.
Yes. Thank you, Lakshman.
Thank you very much, sir. So before we get back to the discussion, I just have one announcement to make. As already put up in our group by Natarajan sir, tomorrow's session, Honorable Justice Mr. Rajiv Shakhtar and Mr. Justice M. Sundar will be gracing our webinar series. There is a registration link which has already been sent. So all the members who have not registered yet are kindly requested to register it immediately, so that a lot of protocols have to be followed before we create a link. So I request all the participants to kindly register yourselves immediately by this evening itself, so that the link can be created soon and can be shared with you. More details on this will be given by APS sir at the end. So thank you once again very much. And I'm sorry for the interruption in between. I will just unmute Vishwanathan sir, Aparna ma'am, and other people who are involved in the discussion. And you can start your discussion now.
Thanks, Prithvi.
Thank you, sir.
Just only one word. I want to thank Jay Kumar for this, my presentation on 16. He's the one who initiated this after I had a very informal conversation with him. So thanks, Jay Kumar. I feel it is worth spending so much of time.
Wonderful listening to you, Penna.
Thank you.
I wanted